The national debt now is over 39.85 trillion. So we're now less than $150 billion away from 40 trillion, which we're going to hit that obviously within the next month, because last month we ran up over $400 billion of debt in a single month. And so we only need about 150 billion to get to 40 trillion. That is the big number. That is what investors should be paying attention to. The rest of it is a bunch of noise. The monthly CPI numbers are immaterial. They're obviously going to go up because of what we're doing on the fiscal side that is ultimately driving the monetary side.
A relatively calm inflation report has reassured parts of Wall Street. But Peter Schiff argues that investors may be watching the wrong number. Behind that CPI headline, the United States recorded a $432 billion federal deficit in July. The national debt is approaching $40 trillion. The Federal Reserve remains divided over interest rates, and disruptions surrounding the Strait of Hormuz have demonstrated how quickly a geopolitical crisis can reach American fuel prices. Schiff connects these developments into one warning: expanding government borrowing, persistent inflation, and declining American influence could strengthen the global shift toward gold and away from excessive dependence on the dollar. But how much of that argument is supported by the evidence? And how much remains prediction? To answer that, we need to begin with what the latest inflation report actually showed and what it may have missed.
Based on the fact that the markets are now reassured by these numbers that the Fed doesn't have to hike. Of course, the numbers are irrelevant. They're backward looking. In fact, more important data on inflation came out later today that I think is far more significant than this backward-looking CPI number, and I'll get to that a bit later in the podcast. But first of all, the reason that the number was still so benign for July is the way they do the accounting. And I had forgotten about this because I had assumed a few weeks ago that the number would be hotter based on the huge rise in the oil price in July. Oil prices were up, 22% or something like that. I think we ended July 82, 83, something like that. We're right around that level right now in energy. Oil prices are about $83 a barrel. We were just below 70 when the month of May ended. But the way they calculate the CPI, they don't compare the price of gasoline or heating oil or, any of these energy components. They don't compare the month end. They don't take the end of June and then the end of July. Because if they did that, the numbers would have been way up. What they do is they take the average price for both months and they compare that. So because we had this huge collapse in the month of June and prices started the month of July so low, even though they ended much higher, the net effect when you compare the average of the 2 months showed that prices were down. But that's irrelevant because what that means is that the July number, is still being heavily influenced by the big drop in oil prices that we had in June. And it's really not reflecting the surge in oil prices that we had in July. So I think the number in and of itself is pretty meaningless. And it also indicates that the August number now is going to be much worse. Even if oil prices just stay where they are, they don't keep going up, the average in August is going to be a lot higher than the average in July. And again, even if they weren't worse than expected, they were still bad. The year-over-year core is still up 2.5%. That's significantly higher, 25% higher to be exact, than the Fed's 2% target. And of course, that number had the benefit of falling oil prices that you're not going to have that benefit in future months. So, but even taken at face value, it's not a good number. And year over year, the headline number is 3.4. How does that square with a Fed that claims that its goal is 2%? 2% inflation, we're at 3.4, and supposedly that means the Fed doesn't have to hike rates. But what it actually shows is if the Fed doesn't hike rates, that 3.4 number is going up, not down. So a rate hike is not only appropriate, but it's long overdue.
Schiff's central point is that CPI measures prices consumers have already experienced. In that limited sense, it is backward-looking. But calling the report irrelevant goes too far. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that consumer prices increased 3.4% between July 2025 and July 2026, while core inflation was 2.5%. Both remain above the Federal Reserve's 2% objective, but the readings were slightly lower than in June. The disagreement is therefore not about whether inflation exists. It is about what happens next. Schiff believes energy costs, government borrowing, and future monetary expansion will reverse that improvement. That is a forecast, not something the July report can prove. And this is where his argument becomes more consequential, because his strongest evidence is not inside the CPI report. It is inside the federal government's own accounts.
But the news that should have been more significant was the Treasury statement that came out later in the day. I think around 2 o'clock Eastern time is when they released that. And this is the official budget deficit for the month of July. And the deficit came in at $432 billion. That's 1 month. I mean, I remember that was a bad year when the government ran a $400 billion deficit for an entire year. That was a reason to be concerned. Now, that's the red ink that was chalked up just in the month of July. That is an all-time record. There has never been a July in the history of the country where the deficit was that big in the month of July. It was an 18% increase in the July deficit from a year ago. So when you're comparing, month to month, all of the other factors are evened out with respect to when the government receives money coming in from taxes and spends money. So an 18% increase. The total deficit now for the fiscal year was reported at 1.7999 trillion. So call it 1.8 trillion. That's in 10 months. So there's still 2 months left of the fiscal year, but this fiscal year, 2026, already tops 2025 with 2 months to spare. And by the way, again, this is all a bunch of government accounting, because during the 10 months where the official deficit was 1.8 trillion, the national debt rose during those identical 10 months by more than 2.1 trillion. So 300 billion more increase in the debt than the official deficit during the same period of time. But this is more of this dishonesty inherent in government accounting. But of course, the bond market, right, they don't care whether the government wants to be honest or not. The bond market is dealing with reality because it's the actual spending that ends up getting monetized, not what's on budget. And the government has to borrow money to pay for stuff, even if it didn't budget it. And this, I believe, is far more substantial and important and forward-looking than the CPI. Because when the deficit is exploding now, what does that mean about future CPIs? They're going to be even higher, because the exploding deficits means more pressure on the Fed to choose inflation. Again, Warsh is correct that inflation is a choice, but the reason the Fed keeps choosing inflation is because the deficits are so big. And the bigger the deficits get, the more pressure there is on the Fed to choose inflation, because the more economic pain is going to be felt immediately if they don't choose inflation. Because if they don't choose inflation, then interest rates are going to soar, and they're going to force the government to slash spending or significantly raise taxes, neither of which is politically viable. So bond investors, all investors for that matter, rather than looking at a backward-looking CPI that's basically obsolete by the time you get the numbers, look at the deficits soaring, the record high deficits in July, as an indication of where inflation is headed, right? It's, don't skate where the puck was, anticipate where it's going. And these deficits tell you that the inflation puck is headed to a much higher number than the number we got now, which is already way above the Fed's 2% target.
The Treasury data confirm the scale of the fiscal problem. but they also add context that Schiff leaves out. In July 2026, the federal government recorded a $432 billion deficit. Through the first 10 months of the fiscal year, the cumulative shortfall reached approximately $1.799 trillion, exceeding the deficit recorded during the entire 2025 fiscal year. However, July's number was enlarged by calendar shifts that moved certain August benefit payments into July. After adjusting for that timing effect, the deficit was approximately $333 billion, still about 18% higher than a year earlier. Total federal debt reached approximately $39.89 trillion by mid-August. That supports Schiff's warning about the scale of government borrowing. But deficits do not automatically produce consumer price inflation on a fixed schedule. The outcome also depends on taxation, private demand, productivity, Treasury financing, and how the Federal Reserve responds. On July 29th, the Fed maintained its target rate at 3.5 to 3.75%. Three policymakers voted for a quarter-point increase. That division shows that inflation risk has not disappeared, but it does not prove that another inflation surge is inevitable. The international evidence is also mixed. Central banks purchased a net 289 metric tons of gold during the second quarter of 2026. Yet the IMF reported that the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves increased to 57.13% during the first quarter. Diversification is real. An immediate collapse of dollar dominance is not. That leaves the biggest question. What happens when America's fiscal pressure intersects with a strategic disruption in the world's most important oil corridor?
And then Saturday, I forget what time of day, it might have been in the morning, Trump called it all off. Hey, we reached a deal. And he said, it's a great deal. They reached out, sir, please don't bomb us. We'll give you what you want. We got a great deal. And Trump posted that the deal will include the total opening of the Strait of Hormuz and an end to the Iran nuclear threat, right? No uncertain terms. We got a deal. The Strait's going to open and no more nuclear threat. That they are not going to even negotiate on a nuclear deal until their terms are met. Their terms, not our terms. And what they're demanding before they will even consider the nuclear deal, right? What do they want? They want the U.S. to pull out of the region, pull our ships out, our troops, all the sanctions lifted. They want war reparations. I think they're talking about $300 billion, something like that. And they want to be in control of the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah, they're willing to open it on their terms. They want to collect the tolls. This is all the stuff that they want. And then if we give them all this stuff, then they'll talk about a nuclear deal. This is where we are. We couldn't be further away from a deal. Yet Trump keeps pretending that a deal's not only around the corner, that he's already got one. But now you're getting stories, credible stories in the media, right, that they're just looking for an exit ramp. And all Trump needs to claim victory is for the Strait of Hormuz to be open. But how is that victory? We had an open Strait of Hormuz before the war started. So now we've redefined victory to getting things back to the way they were before we screwed it all up. So I think that we've made more enemies in the region. But more importantly, and I said this from day one, I said that Iran wins the war by surviving. And they've actually more than survived. They've actually done better than I thought they were going to do. And so this is a huge blow to the credibility of the United States. Yes, but what we accomplished is we made Iran look tough. We made Iran look good. The leaders could say, we stood up to the United States. They attacked us. We were the victims. They were the aggressor. Yes, they killed a lot of our people. But you know what? We stood strong to the great Satan. They couldn't knock us out. They knocked us down, but they didn't knock us out. We're still standing. And you know what? We have more prestige than we had before. We have more credibility. And they're going to end up controlling the Strait of Hormuz, which was completely open before. And now they're going to be controlling it. They're going to have more influence. We are going to have less influence in the Gulf, less influence in the Middle East. And that also has the potential to blow up the whole petrodollar.